Right. Oopsie daisy. Let's go here. Hopefully this is working now. So let's have a look. Let's just make sure it's all working by seeing how much stream delay there is. Oh, there we go. There we go. That's better. Right, we are actually live this time. So, hello everyone. Welcome to this A-level politics discussion stream. We're going to be talking about 3 specific exam questions. We're going to try and keep the discussion to as minimum as possible, so around 20 minutes each, because I don't want to be sat here spending 7-8 hours on these questions, because I know we probably could, because there's so much to discuss. I'll talk about the questions beforehand, just so if you want to have add any kind of input into them before we go on to it. So the first question is going to be about democracy and participation. We're going to ask a very simple question, to what extent is there a democratic deficit in the UK? Okay. The second question, we're going to go to a government-specific question. So to what extent are modern prime ministers now presidents in all but name? So this is a theory of executive powers question. And then we're going to do a political ideologies question. We're going to ask to what extent is liberalism defined by its commitment to individualism? So we're going to talk about liberalism, we're going to talk about prime minister, and we're going to talk about democracy and participation. And we're going to start with democracy and participation. Specifically, to what extent is there a democratic deficit in the UK? Now, whenever we start these questions, let me get my colours so that, there we go, we're going to use this colour. So whenever we start these questions, the first thing we want to do is have a look at, it's a very basic question, okay? We're being asked one thing. We're going to be asked, is there a democratic deficit in the United Kingdom? And our argument is going to be, on one hand it is, or on the other hand it isn't. This is a very simple question. Will this be uploaded on the channel later? Yes, almost definitely. Yes, I'll see if we can get that uploaded on afterwards, so that people who miss this can go over it again. So we're gonna start to highlight the different points. So the only point is we're going to talk about democratic deficit. And so the first thing we want to do is we're going to define our terms. Okay, define our terms. So what is a democratic deficit? What do we mean when we're asking to what extent is there a democratic deficit in the United Kingdom? So ultimately, if anybody wants to chime in on the comments, just let me know, okay? But ultimately, when we're talking about a democratic deficit, we're referring to a general lack of participation. So we're looking for a general lack of participation in democratic processes. So people will be participating less and less in democracy. That is effectively the question that we're asking. And we're asking whether or not this has been the case. So in order to really make a good plan for this, we should really just have both sides of the argument. Okay, so we've got on the one hand there is yes there is. Is this? Yeah, effectively. So Dominic asks, is this the democratic weaknesses in the United Kingdom? So the question that we're asking is, to what extent are people participating in democracy? To what extent is there, a more participation or less participation in the UK as of recently? Okay. So the question we're asking is, think about the democratic processes that exist in the United Kingdom. So think about general elections, referendums, participation in pressure groups, okay, local elections to devolved assemblies, okay, and we could even if we're going to talk about pre-Brexit, we could talk about European Parliament elections as well. Think about these things and how and to what extent do people participate in those processes? That's the question. And when we split this question up into two sides of the argument, because we're being asked to make a balanced argument on either side. Okay, so on the one hand, so yes. There is a deficit. There is a deficit. Okay, that's we're going to talk about on this side, and then we can go on to the other side of the argument, and we'll write no, there isn't a deficit. So no, there isn't. So no, there isn't. And so let's start by looking at the reasons why we might suggest that there is a democratic deficit in the United Kingdom. Has anybody got any kind of points that they would like to make? Okay, I'm just waiting for the stream to to catch up. There's a little bit of a lag on the stream, but that's okay. So, if there isn't, okay, we'll talk about the first point that I've come up with, and with the first point that would be in the mark scheme for this question, okay, and we're going to talk about turnout. Okay, oh my lord, we're going to talk about turnout. Turnout. So, how could we make the argument that people are participating less and less in democracy by using turnout? And there we go, Oscar comes up with it as well. Low turnout at elections, exactly. So, I've got some evidence, some statistics for us here as well. Let me just put a timer on so I'm not going over when we're talking about each question. Could you say that up until 2015, the party in power could decide when to hold an election? That's a very good point. So, not necessarily up until 2015. When we have with the Fixed Term Parliament Act, okay, it was the provision in the Fixed Term Parliament Act was that an election would take place every 5 years, unless a snap election could be called with a majority in the Commons. So, to a general extent, yes, the party in power could decide when to hold an election because the party in power would be the one with the majority in the Commons. But on the other hand, they would be held every 5 years anyway. So we're talking about turnout. So 2015. Let's talk about the 2015 general election. This is the one that was won by David Cameron. Okay. The 2015 general election, the turnout was only 66.4%, which is around nearly 2/3. Okay. Yeah, the Fixed Term Parliament Act. So we've got 66.4% turnout in 2015. Okay, we can only see a very slight increase in terms of turnout in the 2019 general election. Okay, the 2017 general election. Let me get up the 2017 general election as well. Low participation in general and local elections. Exactly, local elections is a big one. So 2017 general election. If we're talking about the 2017 general election, the turnout was, let's just go to 2017 actually. So let's just 2017. Let's do them in order. So 2017, the turnout was 68.8%. So we have a slight increase in 2017 from 2015, but then in 2019, the turnout was 67.3%. So it was down 1.5 or so. Okay. So yes. Okay. Now, when we're talking about turnout as low in 2001, Dom, the question we're going to talk about is I'm going to use that point to argue that, on the other hand, okay, while turnout seems to be relatively low in these elections, 2/3, 68.8%, 67.3%, okay, on the other hand, compared to when we're talking about elections as as early as 2001, following Blair's win in 1997, the turnout is actually considerably higher. So in 2001, we have a 59.4% turnout in 2001. This is in June 2001. So we compare this, or we go on the other hand. So on the other hand, okay, turnout has increased. So turnout has increased, and it has increased relatively quite significantly from 59.4% in 2001. That is down 11.9% from the election beforehand, which was 1997. And then we've only got 61.4% in 2005. And then in 2010 it goes up to 65%, and then we're sort of sitting around the high 60s in terms of turnout. Another thing that could be talked about is while turnout is low, I say low, generally quite low. Let's just say quite low in general elections. Okay, recent referenda, such as the 2016 Brexit referendum, have quite a high turnout. Referenda have higher turnout. So we could talk about 2016 Brexit. 2016 Brexit, we have 72.2% turnout. So we have 72.2% turnout in 2016 Brexit. So you could really go back and forth with this argument. So while turnout is, on one hand, yes, turnout in general elections to start with. We'll talk about other something else in a minute. While turnout is generally quite low in general elections, 66, 68, 73, 67. Sorry. On the other hand, there are 2 points you could make. One, turnout has increased since 2001. Okay, and two, turnout in policy-specific votes like referendums, okay, are generally a lot higher, like 72.2%. On the other hand, we could then talk about turnout in local elections. Does anybody have any data to support an argument about turnout in local elections? It's very good because a lot of people will just talk about turnout when it comes to general elections. If you're somebody that's got that can then reference turnout in local elections, then that shows that you've got shows an examiner or a teacher that you have done a lot more research. Okay, so let's go to the local elections. Now, when we're looking at turnout for local elections, there are a number of stories that we could talk about for local elections, and there are a number of reasons why we could say that turnout is low for local elections. So we've got an example here of 45% for the 2016 London mayor election, which is absolutely ridiculous. Less than half the people who were eligible to vote, and half the electorate voted. So let's add this information here. So 45% for 2016. So for 2016, was it London mayor? London mayor. Okay. I'm going to also put and other elections, because we're going to talk about other elections as well. So other elections, and it goes as low as 38% back in 2012. significant. And we could talk about. I've got a news story here that I've found. So the percentage of registered voters who turned out to the ballot in 2018, and we've got all the different areas. So I'm going to take Hull for example. So Hull 2018, the turnout was 25.3%. 25.3%, which is significant. And there are a number of others here. We've got Halton, Barnsley, Hartlepool, Coventry. Okay, all of these districts, all these areas, and they never go as high as 27% turnout. I'm going to link this in the chat so we can collect evidence together as we plan this. So this is a BBC story about why people don't vote, okay, in council elections. Highest turnout in English local elections. So we do get some higher turnouts in terms of English local elections for 2018 in some areas, some as high as 51.4%, okay. But generally, the turnout for these local elections, okay, can I save this on the channel? I can't stay for long. Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. This is going to be saved and recorded for afterwards. So if anybody has to leave or anybody has to, jump in and out, don't worry about it. They will be saved afterwards, and we'll be doing more than one of these. Okay, we'll be doing this almost weekly if everybody wants it, so we can talk about all kinds of questions. Okay, so you could really spend a lot of time talking about turnout, because the fact that we have so many different types of elections in the United Kingdom. We have the general elections, we have specific referendums, okay, for specific votes. We also have local elections. We also have, you could make arguments relating to elections to devolved assemblies, the devolved bodies. And we could also, before Brexit, okay, you could talk about the European Parliament elections as well. They were also, part of the democratic process. And so you could really come and develop a lot of data. I recommend anybody spend a little bit of time just collating the information and the data, so you have that knowledge available to you when you ever get a question about democratic participation, because you could talk back and forth about turnout for a very long time. There are arguments on one hand that yes, turnout is a problem in some areas, local elections specifically, looking down here. But then on the other hand, turnout has increased, okay, and turnout for certain other types of elections, like referendums, other kinds of votes like referendums, are actually very high, okay. So it generally depends. Let's look at another point. What other points can we talk about? So let's say that that's one paragraph talking about turnout. What else could we talk about? I'm just going to let's see if people comment. Again, there's a huge delay. It's ridiculous. Right. I've got a few points here. If anybody, if there isn't, if people are struggling, I've got points here that we could go at. So referendum on AV was low 40%. Exactly. So again, it's very important that while you can go as back and forth as many times as you want, developing a really complex argument with your essay, because you've got referendums that are very high with Brexit. You've also got relatively low referendums. Sorry, what was the question? The question was, the question is, let me go back up to the top. The question is, to what extent is there a democratic deficit in the UK? Okay, and we've already spent a bit of time talking about turnout. We've talked about turnouts for all the different kinds of elections and referendums. Okay, what other points could you make? What other points could you make arguing either for and against democratic deficit in the UK? I've got a number of points here. So we've got party membership. We'll talk about party membership. The ineffectiveness of first past the post. That's a very good one. That's the one that I've got written down here. So we'll go with that one first, and then we'll come back to party membership. Okay. So party membership. I'm just gonna make a note, just so that we don't forget it. Okay. So first past the post. So first past the post. Okay. So let's just zoom in here. So you've made a very good point here. You said how it fails to represent many people. Now this is very important. So first past the post. Oopsie daisy. First past. There we go. Hang on. First past the post. Okay. So people of there, you could definitely make the argument that first past the post is relatively undemocratic. Okay, relatively undemocratic. Okay, and you can make this argument because of the way first past the post works. Okay, first past the post makes it relatively disproportional. Okay, so disproportional. Okay, and there are a number of there are so many different ways you can show that in terms of evidence. There are so many different things we could talk about. Okay, so we could talk about the fact that in the United Kingdom, if we go back to some general elections, so if we go back to 2019 general election, and we start to analyse the results, okay, we start to analyse the results, and we find that the percentage of the vote that a particular party got, okay, is not necessarily proportional to the amount of seats they got. A very, very good example that I remember always referring to. Oopsie daisy. So we're going to the end of the question. So we'll discuss this. We'll discuss the ones that we've got so far, and then we'll come back. Yes, Dominic, that's exactly the point I was going to make. So the one that I always remember was in 2015. Okay, think what you will about UKIP, but in 2015, UKIP. Okay, UKIP won. You said 13% of the vote. Let me just check, make sure that all the data we're using is correct. Let me find it. Oh, 2015 general election. Whereabouts is it? The BBC always do very good stuff when it comes to election results. You should have it saved onto your computer. Okay. So in terms of England vote share, specifically England vote share, UKIP got 14.1% of the vote. In terms of the amount of seats they got, so they got around 13%. Oopsie daisy. Oh dear. Well, 13%. And in terms of seats they got a big fat 0. They got 0 seats. Okay, nil point. So what we've got here is an example of a smaller party, okay, being not having a concentrated amount of support in specific areas, okay, having a relatively high percentage of seats, 13%. That's nearly we're touching on nearly like a fifth of all the electorate voting for UKIP, okay, and they're getting zero seats. In terms of how that projects into votes, like individual votes, UKIP. So votes, UKIP got 3.6 million. 3.6 million votes. So UKIP were able to, get a significant amount of votes, but somehow unable to win a seat, and that's because of the proportional system. However, what can we say to yes, this does, and it leads to people feeling disillusioned within the political system, leading to voter apathy, and then levels of turnout. Exactly, this is like it's a compounding problem. So you could use evidence like this. You could use evidence like UKIP winning significant number of votes, okay, but then not very many seats. Oh, I say not very many. I say zero at all. Okay, no seats at all, and this will then cause people to be disillusioned with the system. Okay, they feel that their voices aren't being heard, they're getting no kind of representation, which leads to people going, right, well then I'm not going to vote next time, and then that leads to turnout getting lower, and the problem keeps compounding and compounding. Okay, now what could we say is an argument against this point? So we've got it's a very strong point with first past the post. Okay, we've got some good evidence to show why first past the post disproportionately impacts smaller parties negatively. Why could we argue the counter to that? What argument could we make to suggest that why this isn't necessarily a good point? So again, we've got Scotland and Wales using different systems, exactly. Okay, so we've got, on the other hand, we've got different systems. Strong and stable government with clear policy line in need of states of crisis. Yeah, okay. Another point that I think we could make, okay, and it was touched upon very briefly earlier when we were talking about referendums, is that even though first past the post we've already seen is undemocratic, and you can make the argument that it's undemocratic and it leads to voter apathy, but what about the AV referendum? This was a specific example of of the people being given a choice. Okay, they were given a choice as to what kind of electoral system they wanted, okay, an alternative to first past the post, and they voted against it. Now, this is something that we have to take with a grain of salt, okay, because you can make this argument that the AV referendum shows that the people like first past the post, and they like first past the post for all the reasons that we've listed here. So effective as it creates strong government, okay, keeps out extremist parties, okay, these are all very good points. And the AV referendum is an example of, people like it. But then what's the flip side? What's the flip side to that? Okay, so if we talk about the flip side again, we can go back and forth with this like a tennis court. We're going back and forth with these different arguments. The AV referendum. Okay, let me just get up my notes. So the alternative vote referendum, as was already mentioned earlier on, okay, had a relatively low turnout. Okay, so on the flip side, despite the fact that people have already voted and said, we like first past the post, okay, how representative was this referendum? How representative was this referendum? Okay. And the question you could talk about again is you could bring up turnout again, because it only had a 42.2% turnout. 42.2% turnout. So you have a relatively low turnout. Okay. And it also shows, yeah, you were right again, AV referendum shows that the voting systems are not an emotive issue either. Okay. So not only was the turnout very low, nobody really cared about the AV referendum, okay, but the two main parties, okay, so the major parties put a lot of money, okay, into the no vote, okay, into the no vote. Now, what this implies is the major parties, the Conservatives, the Labour parties, okay, the people who don't want to see first past the post go, the people who don't want to have a more proportional system, they put a lot of campaign effort, or a lot of campaign and a lot of political power and wealth and money into ensuring that the AV referendum, okay, would turn out the way that they wanted it to. So you could make the argument that even though the people, okay, voted for first past the post, okay, you could make the argument that this isn't a very representative referendum, a very low turnout, okay. There is a lot of people, a lot of political money and political will went into ensuring that people voted no. And as we know, the amount of spending on a referendum can impact the results, okay. And you could talk also about what we got here. Arguably, 42% of turnout suggests that people really didn't like the idea of electoral reform. A large section of the electorate not turn over also sends a message. Yeah, exactly. And they also made the point that one of the arguments I can remember from 2011 was that AV was too complicated. And compared to first past the post, that's probably true. Okay, most people don't want to, change an electoral system and try and work out how it works. Okay, A-level politics students have to learn how first past the post and how AV and STV, all these systems work. But the general populace just want to know that their vote goes towards something. Okay, they don't want to have to do lots of different kinds of preference voting and all these kinds of things. And that's what another point that people made. They said, well, AV's too complicated. And, AV's, it's really complex, whereas first past the post is simple and it gets the results. So you could go back and forth with first past the post again. So we've gone slightly over when it comes to the question. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to link some information in the chat box for the other points that people were making, okay, and so we can move on to a different question. Just so I want to get all the questions out there, but we can talk. I'll just briefly list the things that we can talk about. Okay, so we can talk. You could talk about the fact that party membership has declined. Okay, that there is less people joining the political parties. But then on the flip side, you could talk about the fact that participation in pressure groups is actually relatively high. And of course, you can list a number of pressure groups that have, millions of members. And you can even talk about the impact of Brexit within the political process. So political participation has arguably increased following the Brexit referendum. Okay, and you've got people campaigning for new parties like the Brexit Party. You can find people campaigning for new pressure groups, like things like Leave.eu kind of pressure groups. Okay, what other parts? You could talk about. This is a really interesting one that I don't think anybody has brought up. You could talk about the fact that in the UK there exists undemocratic institutions. So you could talk about the House of Lords, for one. The House of Lords being an unelected chamber within Parliament. You could talk about the monarchy still being head of state, an unelected hereditary monarch. But then on the flip side to that, you could argue, well, even though that's the case, even though they are technically undemocratic, okay, the extent to which they have any kind of significant political power is questionable. Because you could talk about, in the House of Lords, you could talk about the House of Lords Act, the restricting down of the hereditary peers. You could talk about the Parliaments Act of 1911 and 1949, and how, the House of Lords has a very limited power in rejecting bills from the House of Commons. You could talk about the Salisbury Convention. The Salisbury Convention, as we know, is the convention that states that you shouldn't, the House of Lords shouldn't vote against a policy which is in the government's manifesto. So these are all points you could make against that argument there. So I've given enough points here. Okay, I'm going to move on very, very quickly to the next question because we've got two more to get through. Okay, so I'm just going to create a new one of these. I'll not save it, but we'll be okay. We'll be okay. Right. Let me just do a little bit of moving around, just so we okay, just so we can get this question up and ready. There we go. And then the question is, to what extent are modern prime ministers now presidents in all but name? Now, this is a very, very interesting question, because I would hazard a guess that many people, if they saw this question on an exam paper, would probably choose not to do it. Okay? So they probably would choose not to do this question. And I think if I was, back in school, back in politics, I probably wouldn't do it either, because it's quite a difficult question to talk about. We're talking about the theories of executive power. Okay? Let me just... Now we're all set up. Let's get back to where we are. So, how would people start this question? There's enough of us in here. How would people start this question? So, I've got a number of points that we're going to talk about here. So, how would anybody like to tackle this question first? I understand that this is a very difficult question. I would argue it is quite a difficult question anyway, at least. What can we talk about? If there's no takers, I'll go first, because it is difficult. Constitutional versus informal powers. Okay, right. So we've got our first point. Okay, so personality prime ministers have a lot of legal power, but not much actual power, because the party could remove them, like Tony Thatcher and Blair, even when they won elections. Right, that's a very good point, because I'm going to talk about Thatcher specifically in a minute, because Thatcher is a very good way of arguing against this point. Okay, so this is a question about theories of executive power, and we're going to again split it into two sides. So we're going to have yes they are. So yes they are presidents in all but name. Okay, and I'm going to explain no they're not, they're different. So an argument for why they are presidents in name only. Okay, and this is due to the leadership style of the particular person. We have seen a shift in leadership style. Okay, leadership style in recent times. So with Blair, Bush, Cameron, we've seen a move away from this kind of collective leadership with the government, with the cabinet, to a more of a personal leadership. And this is representative of presidents in the United States. Okay, so leadership style. And we can talk about the ways in which you have a good example. In fact, a good example we could talk about is from 2020, and we could talk about the kind of prime ministerial addresses. So prime ministerial addresses, when the prime minister likes to come on our telly at about 6 o'clock at night or whenever it is to talk about COVID. Okay. This is something that is quite reminiscent of presidents, you know, my fellow Americans, you know, and all this kind of stuff. This is something that's very, very interesting. However, on the flip side to that, you could talk about how the whole cabinet had a role in these kind of addresses to the nation. So the whole cabinet, the whole cabinet had a role. Okay, but we have this kind of interesting way in which the leadership style of the prime minister has changed over the years, and to become more of, it's less of a collective job, because the prime minister, don't forget, is supposed to be the first among equals in cabinet. So first among equals in cabinet. That's technically their job. However, in reality, some would argue that the Prime Minister wields more power than that. Okay, and so we've got this kind of change in leadership style, the change in the way in which the Prime Minister runs. Okay, and you could also use recent elections as well. Recent elections, as of lately, have been centered around the leaders of the party. So if we think back to 2019 in December, the general election, okay, to what extent was mainstream political conversation focused on the people who were not Corbyn, Swinson and Johnson, effectively, and Sturgeon? Okay, to what extent do we talk about other people in the cabinet? Because the cabinet and the shadow cabinet are actually quite significant bodies within politics, but the extent to which that's focused on in the election is a little bit. You're more thinking about the leaders. You're more talking about Corbyn and Johnson and Swinson and people like that. Okay, yes, that's a very good point that I just made. Live TV debates. So leadership style, we could talk about live TV debates. Live TV debates. Something that is a mainstream in US political elections. 2020 election was no different. The 2020 election was had very fun live TV debates, and so in the UK we started to see more and more live TV debates. Okay, so this is another interesting point. Let's have a read at some of the comments. Okay, a larger majority. Okay. So the greater the majority than executive power push through legislation, yeah, okay. Dwight Thomas went yes, but Cameron set a convention to get Parliament's permission before attacking Syria. May, however, launch airstrikes without parliamentary consent. So, okay, yeah, it would be interesting to make the point between the relationship between Parliament and the executive, and I think that that's something that we should talk about on the other side of the debate. So no, they're not. Okay, no, they're not. And the argument, yes, you could definitely make is the sort of constitutional. The sort of constitutional provisions make it pretty difficult, if not impossible, for a prime minister to be effectively a president. Okay, so the constitution, or if anything, constitutional norms make it effectively impossible. Make it impossible. Okay, I'm just going to write that in very brief note form. Okay. And the reason for that is in the United States, they have a separation of powers. Okay? You have a separation of powers in the United States. In the United Kingdom, we have a fusion of powers. So we have a fusion of powers. Okay? And this means that effectively there is less checks and balances between the government and the president. Sorry, between the prime minister and Parliament. Okay, so we have less checks and balances. So we have less checks and balances, which makes it different. Okay. And then we've got a number of points here. Let's have a look. E.g. power to sign treaties, Major signing the Maastricht Treaty, yes, okay. So let's go back to the other side. I'm just trying to add these points here, okay. So you could make the argument, so I'm going to be a bit more broad than the power to sign treaties. I'm going to make the argument that their foreign policy, the powers of foreign policy. So powers of foreign policy. Powers of foreign policy. As we know, those who have studied the US politics, as we know, the President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief, okay? So, the President being Commander-in-Chief, that means that the president has the power to do a number of things on the foreign stage. Okay, power to. However, okay. This is quite a complicated one. I knew it was complicated. So, yes, the royal prerogative gives the Prime Minister the power to sign international treaties. Things like the Maastricht Treaty, things like the Lisbon Treaty. You could talk a lot about EU-related treaties. Okay, so, I keep doing that. I'm trying to draw an arrow, but it just makes it look funny. Right, there we go. So we have things. So we have the power to sign treaties, which you could argue. You could definitely make the argument that is a something that would suggest that prime ministers are very similar to presidents in that regard. They both have the same kind of foreign policy powers. However, if we know anything, okay, the Constitution of the United States provides that the president shall have the power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, okay, provided 2/3 of senators concur. This is Article 2, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. So despite the fact that the president has the power to sign treaties, this is only with legislative consent, okay? So only with not legislative, the consent of the legislature, only with consent of the legislature. And arguably, it's quite a tricky one to make, this argument, because arguably you could say that with a majority, the government could pass through legislation and sign in treaties. The way in which the consent of the legislature is required in America is very different to that of the UK, and this is because of the fusion of powers. Okay, the fusion of powers. There's less of a tension there. If a government has a majority, then they can effectively pass through whatever legislation they would like. Okay, with regard to most things. Okay, I want to talk about another point on this side. I said I was going to bring up Margaret Thatcher, because Margaret Thatcher is a brilliant example. If you're not writing Margaret Thatcher, if you get a question like this and you're not talking about Margaret Thatcher, then I don't know what you're doing. So, okay. Let's find it. Okay. However, on the other hand, so why are prime ministers not like presidents? Okay, a very good point to make. Okay, the cabinet and the collective government is still technically more powerful than the PM. Okay, so the collective cabinet is more is able to oust PM. The legislative branch is able to table a motion of no confidence in the Prime Minister, hence is a form of scrutiny, whereas the presidential system, this is not the case. Yes, there is no system of motion of no confidence in the US system, although you could make the argument that while the legislative branch in the United Kingdom has the power to motion no confidence in the government, in the Prime Minister, okay, Congress has the power to impeach a president, okay, which is, they're not exactly the same, but you could make the argument that while this motion of no confidence isn't something that can be done in Congress directly to the government, a president can be impeached by Congress, by the legislature. So this kind of check on the government, on the executive, is slightly similar to that of the United States. So let's talk about the collective cabinet being able to oust a prime minister, and we're going to talk about Margaret Thatcher, of course. So there can be more powerful figures in government than the Prime Minister. So we've got the ousting of Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher downfall. I remember reading a very good, there we go. A very Welsh coup, it was called, okay? And this is the... I'm trying to find, I'm giving game dates and stuff. Thatcher's politics, yeah, by 1990, she was suddenly vulnerable as never before, unpopular, disliked and considered isolated and out of touch. Unassailable, Chancellor Nigel Lawson resigned a year earlier. Okay. So, let me try and find a very good article about this that we can reference. Yes, we can talk about. So let's just write some notes down. Okay, let's just get some notes down. So we've got Thatcher being ousted by Heseltine. Okay, by Michael Heseltine, and it was Michael Heseltine and Geoffrey Howe. Geoffrey Howe. Okay. So this is an example of the cabinet, okay, taking the reins of power, and trying to ensure the integrity of the party by removing Margaret Thatcher from government, from power as Prime Minister. And the reason for that, of course, is mentioned here. The poll tax was a very good reason. Effectively, Margaret Thatcher's popularity was relatively high at the start, and then it began to wane quite quickly. But then it was quite heavily boosted. I don't think many people thought Margaret Thatcher was going to win until I believe her second general election, until the Falklands War. And the Falklands really drove home, quite a significant amount of patriotism in the United Kingdom, and she was seen as the leader of this kind of thing. She was seen as the person in charge, which is very interesting. I've heard that I believe is it season 4 of The Crown mentions this, the relationship between the Queen and Margaret Thatcher being not so quite as happy as one could be. But eventually, yes, Thatcher was ousted by Heseltine and Geoffrey Howe, and this shows quite clearly that the Prime Minister isn't as strong as a president in terms of their own party, within government. And this harkens back to this idea of first among equals. So first among equals. I've got one more point I want to talk about for this question. Yes, the Iron Lady. The Iron Lady, bless her. Okay, so there is one more point I want to talk about, and this relates to the existence of coalitions and minority government agreements. So how can we talk about this in relation to this question? For anybody who's just joined or anything, the question we're going through is to what extent are prime ministers now presidents in all but name? And we've made some points on this side. Yes, why they are. We talk about leadership style, their sort of foreign policy powers. You can talk about their sort of personality. During general elections, their personality is more on show than their politics. So I'm actually going to put that point here as well. So personality over policy. Okay, so you could harken back to 2019 general election to show this point. At the time it was more about the personality of Johnson versus the personality of Corbyn. Okay, it was less about policy. It was a little bit about policy in terms of Brexit, getting Brexit done, but it was less about that in terms of the manifestos. I doubt many people even read their manifestos. It'd be very interesting to see some polling. So this can link very well with the previous question. First Past Post was largely responsible for giving Thatcher that much power undemocratic. Yes, that's very true. That's very true. Yeah, that's very true. I agree. The use of safer government, Blair, bilateral meetings, distancing themselves from the party. Yeah, as well. The way in which Blair organised his cabinet was very, very interesting. But how can we talk about? Let's just get onto this point here. How can we talk about coalitions? What point can we make? I'm just going to throw out the word coalitions. Okay, and I'm going to see what people can come up with. I'm glad that we've got like 10 or 9, between 9 and 12 viewers. I do like that. That's very good. It's like a small class. Okay. So, does anybody have any points about coalitions? Yes, as a point against the argument that prime ministers are more like presidents, we can talk about the fact that there are we have seen the existence of coalitions and agreements, and we're going to talk specifically. You can talk about the 2010 Lib Dem coalition. So we've got the 2010 Lib Dem Conservative coalition. Okay. This is something that is very, very unlikely to ever happen. You're never going to have a two presidents effectively within the American system. The American system and the way the Electoral College works, okay, and the relationship between the two, between Congress, sorry, and the president. It makes it effectively impossible for us to have a situation where we have presidents that are very similar, that are two presidents within coalition. Clegg, Cameron, Alexander, all the names I always forget. Yeah, so we've got the people. So we have people like Clegg, I believe it's Clegg. Yeah, 2 G's. Clegg and Cameron. Okay, dominating policy. But we also just the fact that coalitions, exist in this system show, is a sign that the way in which our system operates is very, very different to the United States system. And so Clegg, Cameron, Alexander, and I forget the other name. The other name is George Osborne. Yes, they were the 4, the quad. Okay, and if you want to go a little bit further on this, we can talk about coalitions and agreements. So we can talk about coalitions and agreements. So not only do we have a coalition in 2010 to 2015, okay, but in 2017 we also have a minority government. So we have a minority government plus DUP to bolster them up effectively. Okay, so May and the Conservatives making a supply deal with DUP in 2017 May dominated policy even if she was not able to pass many significant bills. Yes, exactly. So despite the fact that we have the DUP agreement, okay? So we have a system here where you have, if we were to try and compare this to a president, okay, you have a system with 2 people who are, in terms of coalitions, where 2 people are in charge and who are both president, a major president and a minor president, like Clegg and Cameron, and then you can also, and how would you have an agreement with how would you be able to compare systems like the minority government and the DUP with the presidential system? It's just constitutionally, and the way in which the system operates makes it very, very, very difficult to make the argument that prime ministers are now presidents in all but name. Okay, I think I think most of the time you would argue, you would make the argument that generally, no, they're not. No, they're not presidents in all but name. Okay, there are some different ways in which their leadership style has changed, in which the media puts more attention towards the kind of personality over policy kind of arguments and stuff like that. But in terms of the actual constitutional norms, okay, in terms of the way the cabinet operates and the way in which the cabinet can oust a prime minister if they're doing a bad job, for example, it shows that prime ministers are still very significantly prime ministers. Okay, we're going to move on to the final question for today, because we are going slightly over, and I don't want this to be a stream that goes on too long, because we're all very busy people, I can imagine. Right, let's go back on and make another image. So, this question, for anybody who wasn't around at the start, this is going to be a political ideas question. Let me just set up the page. There we go. Ultimately, coalitions and agreements are exceptions rather than the norm due to first past the post heavily favouring the winning party, meaning there is normally no need for compromise. That's very true. That is very true. You could make that argument. In response to the fact that, with coalitions and agreements. However, you could then the counter argument is that, generally speaking, in the last 10 years, we have had more coalition and minority agreement than we've had majority party since 2010. We had a 5-year coalition. We had a 2-year majority with the Conservatives, and then we had a 3-year minority government with the DUP. So you could make the argument that even though they are exceptions rather than the norm, as of recently they've been they've become a little bit more common as of recently, and that's due to a number of reasons. May being utterly a really, really poor candidate for running an election, and allowing Jeremy Corbyn to win so many seats. So the question we're going to be looking at finally is, to what extent is liberalism defined by its commitment to individualism? So, what do people think about this question for a start? How would people think about answering this question? Let's just put it up here, and let's just zoom in. So, oh my lord. So how would people think about this question? Yes, the majority. Yes, I think the if people were going to ask what happened in 2019 and the 2019 general election, why did Boris Johnson win such a large majority? Brexit is almost entirely a very, very was a big factor, and also the fact that Jeremy Corbyn was so almost universally hated among a lot of people that you could make the argument that Corbyn was effectively unelectable. So a combination of Brexit, a combination of a bit of Red Scare, accusing Corbyn of all kinds of extremist policies, the problems with anti-Semitism in the party, in Labour, the problem with Corbyn's Brexit position. Okay, his position on Brexit was it's flip-flopped back and forth to the point where he advocated for a second referendum. A second referendum was something that was never going to be supported by the majority of the people, even though arguably if a second referendum was to have happened, people might have still voted to remain back in the European Union. So a number of things happened. But okay, let's move on to this question here. Let's talk about liberalism. To a great extent, because most branches of liberalism, including traditional liberals, neoliberals, and libertarians, focus greatly on the rights of the individual over the collective. Yes, significant extent. Okay, people are arguing for a big yes on this. So they are arguing that liberalism is a very committed to individualism. So arguably, this is a very nice question. I think compared to the last one, this is quite a nice question, just because you've been given quite a broad scope to talk about liberalism as a whole. Okay, you're not asked to specifically focus on classical liberalism or tradition, different kinds of liberalism. So let's start by looking at classical liberalism. I think we could all agree that classical. Let me zoom in. That classical liberalism. Okay, that classical liberalism is very much the individual. Individualism is a big aspect. Okay, huge aspect. However, so people are making the comment that yes, liberalism definitely is defined by a commitment to individualism. People talk about it's a core principle. It's how people define liberalism, but think about how individualism has changed over time within the liberal paradigm. Okay, we have different types of liberalism. We've just mentioned here we have the classic traditional liberalism, neoliberalism, libertarianism. Okay, but the commitment to the same kind of individualism has changed slightly. Okay, so the kind of individualism that is spoken about by classical liberals, refers to human beings being rational, okay, self-interested individuals who are self-reliant and self-sufficient. It talks about so we're talking about humans as rational, so humans as rational agents. Okay, we're talking about a belief in negative freedom, negative freedoms. Okay, we could talk about economic beliefs, so they're very free market. Okay, let's just read some points. Okay, so even though you could argue that modern liberals depart somewhat, you can still focus on how it aids individualism. Yes, modern liberals never state. Yes, I would. If I was going to answer this question, I think the best argument you could construct is that despite people's understanding of individualism, despite people's understanding of individualism changing over the years, okay, changing in terms of different types of liberalism, liberals are still committed to an underlying principle that humans and human natures, that people are individual and people should be free. Okay, liberalism also want laissez-faire, meaning no government intervention in the economy. Yeah, so the classical liberal would point to economic policy and talk about the freer the market, the freer the people. Okay, freer the people. This is also a libertarian argument. So a libertarian argument. And so we have this classical understanding of liberalism, okay, that really does centre individuals and individualism really quite heavily, okay. It believes that humans are rational agents, okay, who are self-interested, okay, and this is a kind of egotistical individualism. So we're talking here about egotistical individualism, okay, which, does anybody know what egotistical individualism refers to? There's a lot of key words we're going to talk about, and we'll get to rules in a minute as well. Yes. What do I mean when I talk about egotistical individualism? natural rights Locke talks about in the two treatises of government. Yes. So when we talk about egotistical individualism, we're referring to human beings that are naturally drawn to the advancement of their own goals. Okay, so people are drawn to the advancement of their own goals. Okay, so this is the kind of Lockean perspective. I noticed someone mentions talking about natural rights and talking about two treatises of government. Yes, Locke talks about these kind of individual points here. Okay, so the best way I would structure this argument and this essay isn't necessarily going back and forth with a for and against. I would do one paragraph talking specifically about classical liberalism and how the individual is really the centre of that belief. Okay, and then I talk more about another type of liberalism and then another type of liberalism as we get into the modern liberalism. Okay, egotistical individualism. People are naturally greedy and will seek their own interest at the expense of the collective. Yeah. So people are naturally drawn to their own goals. They want to advance their own goals and ambitions. Okay. So I think we could all agree. I hope we could all agree that the classical liberal interpretation really does centre individualism quite heavily. Okay, individualism is at the centre of this argument. Now the question is, how has this changed? Okay, let's talk about how has this changed. How has this evolved? So we're going to ask the question: how has this evolved? And I'm going to talk specifically. I'm going to write two names down. We're going to talk specifically about John Stuart Mill. And we're going to talk about John Rawls. Okay, these are two names that we're going to talk about. Now, what did John Stuart Mill say about liberalism and individualism? Okay, and I want to see some key words. And then what did Rawls say? And what did Rawls say? Right. So, we've not had any comments yet. I assume that's because people are typing all sorts about John Stuart Mill. We're going to start by looking at John Stuart Mill. What did John Stuart Mill say about individualism? What did he philosophize, let's say? What kind of philosophical perspective? Democracy. Mill proposed educative votes. Yes, that's true. What did they say about liberalism and individualism? Sorry, Rawls' veil of ignorance. Yeah, again. But what did they say about the individual? The type when we're talking about individualism. I'm just trying to find. Is anybody familiar with the term developmental individualism? Developmental individual. Is anybody familiar with the term developmental individualism? Okay. I'm just wondering, because if we're going to be talking about individualism specifically within the realm, within the context of liberalism, I think developmental individualism is one that we should really explore. Okay. So, let's just describe what developmental individualism is. So, according to John Stuart Mill, developmental individualism, which is it's a mouthful and a half, let's be honest, okay, really relates to how individuals could develop. Okay, it relates to the how people develop. So we're going to talk about how people develop. How people develop. Okay, but we're also talking about so compared to the a kind of original understanding of individual. Okay. Compared to the harm principle and developmental individualism. Oh, somebody did write about developmental individual. I didn't see that. Sorry, I saw some. I thought nobody had mentioned developmental individualism. Thank you for making that note. Yes, developmental individualism and the harm principle, exactly. So, how people develop, okay? So it focuses on how humans could be, okay, rather than how they currently are. Rather than how they currently are. So this is still a commitment to individualism. We're still committed to individualism as liberals, okay, in this framework. But we're just trying to work on a different. We're trying to work on a different understanding. Individual freedom directly linked with human flourishing. Exactly. The freer they are, the better they can develop. It's about how people develop. Exactly. That's exactly right. Okay. So we're going to I'm going to write that down. In fact, okay. I'm going to write freedom. I'm going to do a little equation. Freedom equals development. So notice that we're still committed to individualism. Okay. And even when I looked at the mark scheme for this question, there wasn't much talking about how liberals aren't committed to individualism. I think you'd struggle structuring an essay on this where you go back and forth and you try and, like what we did with the other two questions, where you go back and forth and you try and go, well, on the one hand they are committed to individualism, on the other hand they're not. That's a difficult one that's a difficult essay to write. What's an easier essay to write is to talk about how the liberal understanding of individualism has changed over time, but that it's still individualism that they're committed to. So we could talk about John Stuart Mill and his developmental individualism. I'm going to stop saying individualism soon because it's starting to sound like it's not a word. Okay. What about the more modern? I'm going to talk about Rawls as well, but let's talk about also talk about the modern liberal. Okay. So you could make the argument that economically, they're less free market. Okay. There's a less free market understanding with the modern liberal. Okay. According to the more modern liberal, we have there's a push for there's a push for welfare state. So for welfare state and government intervention in the economy. Now, obviously, less of an extent than a socialist would make that claim, but they're still less free market than a classical liberal would argue. Okay, and this ties a little bit into when we're talking about John Rawls. So what did John Rawls say? John Rawls is a very interesting character. I remember studying John Rawls at university. Very interesting indeed. So, when it comes to referencing John Rawls, we've got a number of points that we could talk about. We could talk about a number of key phrases that we have in his theory of justice. So let me go to John Rawls. So according to John Rawls, we have this idea of foundational equality. Okay. We have his original position, in which, the original position in which John Rawls asks us to, in a thought experiment, develop a, to think of society in a very certain way, and just like, let me think about this. So we're trying to construct a kind of society, okay, that we would argue is better we would argue is better than the one that we have now, okay, and to the question how wealth and power should be distributed within this system. So John Rawls talks about foundational equality, and yes, no surrender to socialism is a very good point. Okay, we have this foundational equality, and under the original position and the veil of, have I spelled veil correctly? I don't think I have. Veil of ignorance. That's very good. There we go. Under the veil of ignorance, we imagine society. You can imagine an original position, a society that is better than we have now. Okay, and under the veil of ignorance, people don't know whereabouts they fit into society. Okay, and allowing us to imagine this scenario. Okay, we're asked how wealth and power should be distributed, and he argues that people would make the claim that there should be there should be a great amount of wealth and power distribution. So wealth plus power redistribution. Okay. Rawls believed that the power should be improved by the state, which is distinct to socialism, but he did not argue for a gap to be narrowed. This is very true. Okay, this is very true. This is correct. Okay, this is what sets apart Rawls from a more socialist idea, from a more socialist distinction. Rawls believed in the power in redistributive justice. He believed in the power that wealth and power should and could be redistributed without us devolving into socialism. Okay. And he also, Rawls also, despite this, okay, despite the fact that we've got distribution, he still argued that that individualism was still centre. Individualism was still a central thesis. A central thesis. Okay. And it should be done via the enabling state. Correct. Exactly. Correct. So, yeah. Respondents to Rawls, people like Friedrich von Hayek, argued that this kind of idea of redistribution of wealth is what you've said in the comments, is a surrender to socialism, and Rawls said no, it's not. Okay, the idea of redistributive justice is completely consistent with liberalism. Okay, it fits into the liberal framework, and he uses the original position and the veil of ignorance to try and to formulate his argument, his thought experiment here. But notice as well that this is a very significant difference. Both John Stuart Mill, with his sort of developmental freedom, okay, and John Rawls have very different understandings of liberalism to what we would describe in the kind of egotistical John Locke classical form of liberalism. But the central thesis, okay, a central commitment to liberalism, a central commitment to individualism is still present. We still see that individualism is present in this one as well. Down here, it's still a central part of even Rawls's understanding. Okay, so in terms of how I would structure this essay, okay, like I've already mentioned, I wouldn't structure this essay as a kind of back and forth, asking whether or not liberalism is defined by its commitment to individualism. I would make the argument, okay, that liberalism is, okay, it is defined by its commitment to individuals and individualism. However, the understanding of individualism, the way in which that has changed through the different eras of liberalism, the sort of classical, we could talk about the sort of semi-modern era, like with John Stuart Mill, and then talk about Rawls, how they talked about individualism. You could make an argument like that, and you could make an essay like that that's structured that way, that is still a very high, that does very well. Okay, I think this is actually, in reality, Okay, I think that this essay would actually be quite difficult because there's very little on the other side of the debate as to whether or not we do have a commitment to individualism. It's very difficult. It's very whether there's not a commitment to individualism. So those are the 3 questions that we've done today. I hope everybody has enjoyed it. If anybody wants to carry on discussing some bits, leave it in the comments. I'm going to post some articles and some points and maybe some notes, okay, in the chat, so people can bolster their knowledge and their evidence. I hope people have enjoyed this as well. Okay, what we're going to do, if we do this next week, okay, we will do 3 new questions. I think what we should do is generally always do a political ideas question. Okay, we should always do a UK politics question, and then maybe do a US politics, a comparative politics kind of question, something like that. This is going to be, if it goes well, this is going to be a weekly occurrence for people. For people who also, thank you very much. Politics exam tomorrow, my lord. Well, I hope it goes well. If you've got any questions, let me know. For the people in here as well, by the way, just before anybody goes, the people who are in here who study history A-level as well and use my content for that, I will also do a history stream where we do very a similar thing but for A-level history. The difficult problem with history, okay, is that are these live streams on a regular schedule? Yeah, probably. We'll probably do this Mondays or whenever most people are free. Okay, that's probably the best thing we should do. The problem with, like I said, the problem with A-level history is, unlike politics, everybody studies the same thing in A-level politics. It doesn't matter if you're at Excel or you're AQA, you basically study the exact same thing. So this question about liberalism, okay, or the question about the Prime Minister, anybody who studies politics can get involved and understand the point. If you're studying history, however, you pick there are 2 modules that you do out of a list of about 20, and lots of different people do lots of different modules. A lot of people do the Tudors, a lot of people do Russian Revolution, a lot of people do English Civil War, etc, etc, etc. So it's going to be difficult for me to try, because I've already taught, I believe, 8 different history modules on this channel, so it's going to be difficult for me to try and get as much content in, so there's many people who are studying history are studying the right. I might do a poll to see which history modules are most popular on this channel, and then do the history modules as well. But I will do history. Probably sometimes this week. I'll have a look. I'll see how it goes. Okay, but we'll still be doing politics on a regular. So thank you very much, everybody who was here. Okay, we plan for them to be postponed. What, the exams? Plan for the exams to be postponed. Oh dear. You studied Tudors in Germany. Yes, Tudors in Germany. I think ultimately the Tudors is one that almost everybody does. Tudors is a very popular one that people do. Okay, and then Germany is also relatively popular, but also so is Russian Revolution and Tsarist and Communist Russia. So also British Empire is quite popular too. I've had people tweeting me asking for more British Empire content. So we'll have to see. I'll see how I can make it work. But rest assured that if I'm doing the history streams as well, Tudors in Russia and Tudors in Germany. So if I'm doing the history stream as well, I'll make sure that all the content, all the courses, and all the modules that I've taught of history will get covered at some point. I'll do like maybe a cycle or something, or maybe in one live stream we do a question from a number of different things. So this is the kind of thing we're going to do. So I hope everybody has enjoyed. Thank you very much. If you want to like and subscribe, and if anybody if you know anybody that would find these kind of videos helpful, who are maybe struggling, let them know, because the more people that we get out here to study some politics, the better, and the more people get better grades. So thank you very, very much.